the end of the presentation. I am happy to try and answer questions for you, and I will apologize for clearing my throat. I'm kind of losing my voice a little bit, so we'll see how well this goes. Also, during the presentation, if you have questions that you want to ask, please raise your hands. I don't take questions at the, well, I'll take questions at the end, but I take questions as we're going, so that you can get specific questions answered. I'm hoping you will come away from this presentation with some more information than you had when you walked in that applies to your specific situation. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we're trying to solve. We're going to cover what I consider the three basic branching patterns, which are branch by release, by quality, and by feature, and the situations that they're applicable in and the pros and cons. And then we'll talk a little bit about what kind of strategy to pick and what questions you want to ask when you're picking your strategy. So what are we trying to solve with branching? And by the way, I guess before I go into what we're trying to solve with branching, one thing I want to say is that no branching is a valid strategy. There are valid reasons why you don't want to use branching. Branching can add to your complexity. It's just that in my experience, you really can't get away with at least 2 branches. So if you can avoid branching altogether, avoid it. It makes life simpler. But most cases, that's not necessarily going to work for you. So what are we trying to solve? We want to be able to release code when it is ready. That means we do not want to release code that's partially in work. Say you've got 2 developers. They're both working on a feature. One developer finishes, the other one's 75% done, and your boss goes, let's release the code. What happens to the code that's 75% done? It's been checked in. You can't pull that 75% of the code out, so you've just released code that's not ready to be released. It's not tested, it's not completed, it's more than likely to cause problems. You want to be able to do independent construction of features, so feature branches. You want to be able to build features differently. You want to be able to release them at different times. You want developers to be able to take independent feature branches so that they can do some of their own work privately without screwing up anybody else. You want to avoid the suspension of coding or a code freeze. I happen to use that term because it fit the acronym well. But you want to avoid a code freeze. So what happens there? If you are developing, you get to a certain point and you say, okay, we're going to release this code to test. If you're not using branches, then developers logically cannot continue coding on to the next release or do any other work, because if they check in code, then if the tester finds a bug and you have to go fix it on that branch, then you're going to include code that's not ready for release or that you are playing around with. So we want to avoid that situation, want to avoid developers sitting around twiddling their thumbs. You want to know what code is released. So for companies that are under SOX compliance or HIPAA compliance or various other compliances that are out there, you have to know what goes into a release. You got to know what to test also, but you really need to know what goes into a release, and you want to avoid it. So what are we trying to do here? We're trying to reduce, minimize risk. We want to eliminate risk from our process as much as we can. Can you eliminate all of it? No, you can't. But you can eliminate a lot of it by picking a sensible strategy. So the various branching patterns. Start with the first one. This is branch by release. By the way, these names are mine. I've seen them named things various places differently. If you search for this, maybe you'll find something, maybe you won't. So the way this pattern starts off is you're working on a single line, release 1 in this particular case, single branch. At the point where you get to ready to testing, you will take another branch for your release 2 work. And you'll continue working on release 2, so this avoids us the code freeze. You'll do your testing on release 1, and you'll eventually release it to production. And this pattern just continues on and on and on. This is the simplest pattern conceptually to understand. You're only ever working on one branch unless you have to go fix a bug, which I'll talk about in a second. But conceptually, it's the simplest to understand. People have complained that this pattern gets very wide. I'm not sure what very wide means. My branching structure goes straight down. I don't get the wide thing or why somebody thinks that's a problem. Promoting code fixes is very simple in this pattern. Where it becomes difficult is if you have many releases and those releases are all in production at the same time, you can start running into problems as you are doing merges, as you're doing forward integrations. The more forward integrations you have to do, the more likely it is that those integrations are going to start not working so easily. And I'll talk about that in just a second. So handling bugs, in this particular situation, if I do my release, my branch to release 2, and I'm doing testing and I find a bug on my release 1 branch, it's very easy for me to go back to my release 1 branch, fix whatever the problem is, have it tested, and merge it down into release 2. Now release 2 has my fix for release 1. And this can continue on regardless of where you are. So if I find a bug in production, it's very easy to go pick up the source code from that branch, because it's all on the R1 branch, fix it, test it, and forward integrate it. It's going to get into the release 2 testing cycle or the development cycle, and again, you forward integrate it. And you can keep doing this over and over again, but like I said, with each forward integration, it becomes more and more difficult to do your integration. There's a higher likelihood that the code that you are forward integrating has changed. Part of this is a process that you have to go through when you find a bug in an earlier release. You've got to test all the other releases to make sure the bug is still there, because maybe it's disappeared in a later release. So you may not have to forward integrate all the way down the line, but it's something to consider. The other thing is while you can manage multiple releases that are in production, this is a perfectly valid pattern to do this, you'll notice that these releases build on top of one another. So in a situation like if you are a company who's putting out tools, let's say you're a company like Infragistics or Component One, which I have no idea what their internal structure is for branching is, but they put out 3 to 4 releases per year. They have to maintain those releases independently. Does it make sense to use a pattern like this? Yeah, it's 3 or 4 releases, and they don't support older releases beyond that. They expire after a certain period of time, so they're limited to 3 or 4 releases. But let's say you put out a product that's going out to 10 different teams or 10 different companies, and every company wants their own little versions of things. Does this pattern work? No, it doesn't. It'll break down really quickly and cause you a lot of problems. And another point to address with that also is that there are no bad patterns. There's a bad application of patterns to your particular needs. If you have the wrong pattern for the right need, then you can get into problems there. So it's something to consider as well. So how do we handle multiple concurrent releases, which the branch by release stairway pattern doesn't? So this pattern is called the main line. That is actually a common term for this pattern. In this one, again, conceptually simple to understand, but can get very difficult depending on how many parallel releases you are working on. So you start off on the main branch, and this is the branch that you generally do your releases out of. I say generally for a reason, because this gets a little sticky, and I'll talk about that in a second. You branch off for release 1, you do your release 1 work. At a certain point you go, okay, we're working on release 1, but we want to do 1.1 also. So you can branch off release 1 to 1.1 and continue working on that. And you can release your R1 at any particular time. You can just merge it down to main, do your testing, and release it. Now, this begs a question, and one gentleman had asked about baseless merges and how to kind of avoid this. This situation gets you into a baseless merge situation, but not in a negative way. So there are some baseless merges that are really bad. There are other baseless merges that are not quite as bad. This one is not quite as bad. The reason being is because once I do release 1 and I push it out the door, I have no merge back up to 1.1. I want to make sure that 1.1 has at least all the stuff that release 1 had in it. So I've got a couple of choices. I can merge up from 1 to 1.1. So I can simply do a merge up that way. It's a fairly simple, basic merge. Or I can baseless merge from main up to 1.1. Obviously, best practice there is to merge from 1 to 1.1, but there might be other reasons why you might not be able to do that. So this pattern lets you work as many concurrent parallel releases as you want. This one can also get really complicated really quickly. It's a good idea to document all of the work that you do, all of your structures and your branching patterns and your processes, Towards the end of the presentation, I will actually show you samples of a couple of documents we give to customers that we recommend everybody create that will help make life a little bit easier. And if anyone wants a copy of those documents, they're more than welcome to email me and I will send them a copy. Any questions on what I just showed before I walk into the demo? No, okay. Okay, so for the branch by release, and hopefully everyone can see this, I made the font super large. I've got a release branch. This is TFS 2010 with Visual Studio 2010, obviously. I've got my code, in this case an application called Blog Engine. You're probably familiar with it. It's blogengine.net. It's an open source blogging tool. You go along, you work on your release to whatever point that you are done working on it. Simply right-click, branch, call it release 2 and branch it. And it's a server branch, so it's fairly quick. And now I've got release 2 branched. And at this point, I can, again, continue to work. I can branch this again. I'll branch it to release 3. And let me just do a get latest here. Can't do anything to make this go faster. Probably should have used a smaller application, but I figured a real application would probably be better. And almost done. Okay, we're done. So at this point, I can actually take a look and I can visualize my branching structure to see what's happened here. So if I dive into here, and do track change sets, oops, that's not actually what I wanted to do. I did want to do this, though. Okay, that's not working exactly right. Let me go back here. Let's try this one more time. Okay, this isn't showing me my merges to my other versions. I'm wondering what it is that I'm missing here, but I probably should have done something. Oh. This always helps, being able to see the rest of it and actually select your branches. This works a lot better. Okay, now that I can actually see the screen, you've got this basic structure that I laid out there. So this conceptually looks exactly like what I showed you on the PowerPoint, where you've got a very clean structure for release 1, release 2, release 3. So if at a certain point in time I have to go make a change to release 1, I can just open up the code. And in this particular case, I'm just going to do the typical, I'm making a simple change. So we'll come back here and add a comment in here somewhere. And save it and check it in. With no comment and no work item. Don't do what I do, just, yeah. Okay, so that's checked in. And at this point, you want to forward integrate it to your next release. So it's as simple as doing a merge, and I can do this visually as well. So I'm just going to merge it to release 2. It automatically picks my next branch, latest version. Do a finish. And I go and check in the change. So as I'm doing this, and in fact, I'll show you this visually as well. And I'll make sure to actually check everything this time. So if I do my timeline tracking, I've actually got this. And again, hierarchy, I can see this. And what I'm going to do here, now that I've figured this part out, is show all of them. And you can see that this change set merged from, so change set 31, which I can actually view the change set details on. You can see where I branched it from. Oh, and let's see. And I want to take this, and oh, I'm looking at the wrong file. Helps if we look at the right file. So viewing the history for this, and then tracking the change set. And timeline tracking. Oh, okay, so you can see this is now change set 31. Oh, wait a second, doing this wrong thing again. Rerun. Why am I not seeing this one? 15, source control. Okay, this is puzzling. I'm not seeing this change set here. We'll try this again. Ah, there we go. So now I've got 34 that made it there. And I can visually just merge this down to release 3 as well. So release 2, release 3. Do a finish, and it's the change set. And now when I do a rerun, oh, got to track the new version of it, which moved down to release 3. Let's go in here, view history. No, that's not going to give it to me. Oh, yeah, that's right. Glad the audience is here. Check it in. I'm 10 steps ahead of myself here. Let's try this one last time. Okay, there we go. Now my change is down into 35. I can view the fact that I made the change to the one file. I can diff it between the various versions. It's a very clean model for doing it as long as you remember to check in your code, which lesson I'm not going to forget anytime soon, so I shouldn't do that for the rest of the demos. Very simple process for moving your code forward. It's not likely to get lost in there. It's very easy to see where you go. The next pattern is probably what I would consider one of the more ubiquitous patterns. Everyone's fairly familiar with it if you've read Microsoft's branching guidance. How many of you have read Microsoft's branching guidance? Okay, a fair number of you, about half of you. This is the pattern that they present as kind of the main pattern for doing software development. They say in there that it doesn't meet all software development needs, but that it meets most of them. I'm not sure whether or not I agree with that or not, but I'm going to walk you through this. It's a simple structure. It's production, it's QA, or what Microsoft calls main, which is the branch that you do your testing and releases out of, and development, where you do your development work. Down the side, you'll notice I've got an arrow that's going firm to soft. Higher branches in the hierarchy are considered firm because they don't change as much. Lower branches change more. So soft branches change very frequently. There's another variation on this, which is the safekeeping branch. Somebody asked, how do we put our code away so that we've got a copy of what we released? This is how you do it. When you release code, you simply branch it and you leave that branch alone. You basically dead end the branch. Then you have a copy of what went into production. Another version is having a permanent hotfix branch. So when you're dealing with code fixes, your fixes get more complicated with this pattern than what you saw on the branch by release pattern, which was just fixing it on a single release, on a single code line. This one, it's not quite as simple. This pattern also is only really applicable if you are maintaining a single version of a release. You cannot maintain multiple versions of a release with this pattern. If you do, you're going to get into a world of hurt. And I'll show you how complicated it gets with a relatively simple example, and you'll be able to extrapolate beyond that to how complicated it can get. So this is a simple example. What happens when a bug is found in test? So to start off the structure, you can go prod to QA, branch prod to QA, and QA to dev. It doesn't matter which direction you branch these. You can branch dev to QA and QA to prod, or QA to prod and QA to dev. As long as the relationships exist between the branches, TFS doesn't really have a notion of a parent or child. They're just two branches that are related to each other. So this is showing a permanent hotfix. So when the QA branch is created, you branch to create your hotfix. The developers work on release 1. And at a certain point, they say, okay, we're done with release 1, and we're going to push that up to QA for testing. Now, you notice I've got a forward integration arrow here going from QA down to dev, and then a merge from dev to QA, or reverse integration from dev to QA. This pattern is called merge down, copy up. And the reason is because we want any merge conflicts to happen on our softer branches, not our firm branches. So when I do the merge down from QA to release 1, if there are any merge conflicts, which there shouldn't be, and the reason is because one of the rules with this pattern is you don't do development in the QA branch. That's for stable code that's not going to be worked, right? Testers are testing it. You don't want to change stuff on that branch without there being some sort of communication mechanism. So we try and avoid it altogether. So you merge back up. There won't be any merge conflicts at this point. And you start testing the code. And while you're testing the code, you find a bug. So where do you fix it? The developers have started on release 2, so I can't fix it on the development branch. Otherwise, I'm going to get code that's not ready for release mixed in with my fix. Or you have to do cherry pick merges. I don't spend a lot of time talking about cherry pick merges, but what a cherry pick merge is, it's when you select just a specific change set to merge. So let's say you have change set 1 through 5, and you say, I'm only going to merge change set 2. Cherry pick change sets, very bad. They work exactly the way they're supposed to, and they never work the way that you expect them to. The merging becomes very difficult. Every time I've ever had to do a cherry pick merge, it's taken hours of time sitting with the developer to figure out what really should go there. Very hard to do, so just avoid it. Save yourself a lot of trouble. So you will merge from QA down to hotfix so that you can actually do your fix with the latest code that's in QA. You will do your fix. Again, you'll do a merge down, copy up to get your fix back into QA. You'll continue testing. You'll do your release. And this is showing a permanent production branch. You can also do safekeeping branches. Either way works. And then once I've done the release, I will merge it back down to my other branches. Technically, you don't have to merge this back down to hotfix because it's already got your changes there. But you do want to do the merge from QA down to your release branch. So that way you've got the hotfix that you did for release 1 into release 2. So you're not going to have yourself a regression bug there, hopefully. This next slide that I'm going to show you, take with a grain of salt. I show it to show the complexity, but it's not something I think you should ever do. The next slide that I'm going to show shows a very specific scenario. I have a release that's out there that users are using. I have the next version, release 2, that's in testing, and I'm working on release 3. With this pattern, that gets really problematic. So you can see there's a bunch of things going on here, including rollbacks and some other stuff. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about this, but this particular problem is a big issue. And it comes into the strategy you pick when you're trying to determine what branching structure you want. If you have a very short window for your release cycle, so let's say you do a release every 2 weeks, it's far easier to go to a customer and say, hey, we know you want to get this fix in there. Can I wait until the next release that's only 2 weeks away? Versus you've got a release cycle that's 2 months long and you've got a huge testing cycle in there. Customers are much less likely to say, well, we can wait 4 or 5 months for that rather than 2 or 3 weeks for that. Because in this particular situation, the best answer is to tell the customer, wait until the next release, not try and fix it here because of the complexity. But this is where we kind of break the rules for this particular pattern, and it's okay to do this. You just have to really understand why you're doing it. A better solution than trying to fix this problem on a hotfix branch is to use a simpler view, which is to simply fix it in production, fix it on the production branch. So in this particular case, what you're doing is you're actually going to your safekeeping branch and you're making the change here. And you're testing here, and then when you're done testing and you've released it, then you're pushing it down to QA for the next release, and then you're pushing it down to dev for the release after that. The reason why this is a rule break in my particular view is because every time you push something to testing, you need to have an actual test environment. And you need to understand that when you pick a branching structure, there is a cost associated with it because I have to have a physical test environment in order to do the testing for that branch. For example, in this particular case, I need a test environment for my QA branch, and I need a test environment now for this production branch that I'm pulling code out of. I can't simply drop my new release code into my QA branch. Well, I mean, I guess you could, but you'd have to start your QA testing over again, which you might have to do anyways because you're incorporating a fix that's now going to be merged into your next release. But there is a cost associated with this. This becomes more apparent when we get to feature branching. But this particular structure is much easier to handle than going back and forth with rollbacks and fixing it, trying to fix it on a hotfix branch. So any questions on this particular structure? Yes? So the question was, is there no reason to create a hotfix branch off of production? So in other words, if I've got you right, creating a hotfix branch off of here, fixing it, testing it, merging it up into production and down. The answer is no, you can absolutely do that. In fact, we have one customer who wants all of their hotfixes on separate branches and they're labeled with the hotfix number so that they can always go back and figure that out. So yes, you can do that. I don't particularly show that here because the more branches you add, it still adds complexity to the process. So we want to try and minimize it where it makes sense, but that's perfectly okay to do that. Any other questions? Okay. Oh, yes. Does this strategy lend itself more towards iterative releases? So oddly enough, that's something that I don't cover too much in my talks because the iteration cycle that you go through really shouldn't be a huge factor in your branching patterns. The length of your iterations is a bigger consideration than whether or not you're doing iterative or waterfall development. So in this particular case, yes, it's perfectly fine to do in an iterative cycle. You can actually use any of these branching patterns iteratively. Some lend themselves better than others, but it depends, again, on the length of those iterations and how long your end users, your business, is willing to wait for fixes to things, new features for things, that sort of, those sorts of considerations. But there's nothing that really would say something is not suitable to iterative development, whether it's short or long. There's just trade-offs that you have to make. Other questions? No? All right, so jump into a demo. This time I'll remember to check my code in. Okay, so branching by quality. In this particular structure here, this is basic structure, so I just want to show you what this looks like. So the basic structure, I started off with prod, I branched it to QA, I took QA, I branched it to dev. Again, the order that you do this in doesn't really matter. It's just that you want to make sure those relationships are there. So this particular one is really the easiest to demonstrate. So I'll come into dev because I'm going to do my development work on the development branch and not on any other branch. And I'll come into default and make a change to that again. Didn't want to bring the form up. This will come up eventually. I can take questions if anyone's got them. I might be waiting a minute or two. Yeah. That's right. So what the gentleman was saying was that when they do merges for their service stuff, they would like to be able to go into a work item and take a look at the associated change sets and be able to merge those, except TFS limits you to doing contiguous change sets when you're trying to do a cherry pick. So if I have change sets 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I want to merge change set 3, what it's actually going to do is take change sets 1, 2, and 3. It's not going to let you just pick 3 out of the middle of there. It just won't take over 4 and 5. One reason why we really steer people away from doing that is not necessarily, so there's technical reasons also, right? The way cherry pick merges work, technically there can be issues. The bigger reason is discipline. Most developers do not work on just one thing at a time when they say they're working on it. So I will give you an example. I do this all the time, and I did this the other day, and it's actually come back to bite me now. I was working on one thing, on one work item, and I switched over to work on something else. I did a check-in, and I checked both things in against my first work item. I had to go back and manually extricate the change set and associate it with my other work item. Yeah, unfortunately though, lots of developers do that. We as developers like to multitask. We like to switch back and forth and work on multiple things. How many of you are only working on one thing right now? That's what I thought. Point made. So try and avoid the cherry pick. Yeah. Well, I understand it's a reality check though. This is where theory and reality don't quite work. So I'm going to merge dev to QA now that I made my change while I was talking. And I'm going to merge it. I'm going to remember to check in my changes this time because that's helpful. Now I've got my change up to QA, and we can assume we're going through some sort of testing and somebody finds a problem in QA. I want to fix it. So in QA, I'm going to go ahead and take a branch off of this, a hotfix branch. Branch this, we'll just call it hotfix, select branch, yes. And we'll do a get latest on this. Okay, so I've got this view of it now. Now what I can do, just to show you kind of where this has come from, if I do a view history here, I do my track change sets. And I got it all. Okay, now you start getting something that looks a little bit more complicated, and no, you can't actually control the order of branches and how they show up here. So I went from prod to QA to dev. I made a change in dev. I merged it back up to QA, and then from QA I took a hotfix branch. Again, visually, this is starting to look a little bit more complicated, but it's pretty straightforward in its execution. It's easier to visualize the hotfix branch above the dev branch, but it's still fairly straightforward and easy to understand. So at that point, I can go through the rest of my gyrations. I can fix my bug on hotfix, merge it back to QA, and then take QA and merge it down to dev and release to production. Are there any questions on this? The process, again, is fairly straightforward, fairly easy to understand. Yes? Say that a little louder. So you can't do parallel development with this structure. It just doesn't lend itself to that at all. We have seen people try and do this, but really what they do, they're kind of mixing branch by feature with this pattern, which you kind of have to, because branch by feature doesn't stand on its own. And I'll show you that in a second. And that's really more for parallel development than what this is. Other questions on this? Is it? So yeah, so you can do mainline with, so you can do parallel development with the branch by release, the mainline version of it, but you can also do it with feature development, with feature branches. So there's multiple ways that you can actually do that. It's just that this pattern, standing on its own by itself, if you're trying to do parallel development, you're in a world of hurt. Okay. Okay, branch by feature. This is a fairly straightforward, again, easy to understand structure that can get a little bit complicated, but not too much, not too much. And it offers a lot of flexibility in what you do. So this one you'll notice, I've got my feature branches down below, but I've also got a branch by quality structure up above. I still have to have some sort of a release process for all of my features and some sort of merge and integration process for all of my features, because I'm releasing my features together as a single application, presumably. So this structure starts off going from prod to QA, QA to dev, and again, the branches up here that make up the quality part of your branching structure, they're kind of optional. You can do it multiple ways. I'll actually show you 2 different ways that one of our customers did it. And then off of dev, you'll take feature 1, feature 2, feature 3, whatever those features happen to be. And you're going to do active feature development on each of these feature branches. But it's important to note that you will also be doing maintenance for your existing in-production release, most likely, on your dev branch. So you'll be doing things like bug fixes and things like that. Although you could do bug fixes and change requests and that, those other types of work as separate features. It gets a little crazy. I had one person who wanted to take a branch for every user story that they worked on or bug. So any product backlog item that they worked on, they had a ton of branches. It got really out of hand. There's not a huge cost to branches in TFS, so you could do that, but visually it's hard to figure out where things are moving from and to. And if you can't visualize it easily, you can get lost really simply. So this particular structure here, you're working on your feature 1 branch. At a certain point, you go, okay, feature 1's good to go. I want to merge it up into my dev branch. So you'll do a merge down from dev. And again, that's to get any maintenance fixes that have been done or any maintenance work that have been done on the current version. You'll test it appropriately, and then you'll push it back up into the dev branch. It's important to understand at this point, though, and there's no arrow at the end of that line, that once I push that up into my dev branch, it is in my dev branch. I can no longer pull it out. Theoretically, I can pull it out if it's the last change set, nobody's checked anything in since. But at that point, if I find any problems with feature 1, I'm not fixing it on my feature 1 branch, I'm fixing it on my dev branch. You are making the commitment when you merge into your dev branch that you are going to release this with the next release. It's not going to be something you pull out. Another thing to note about this structure is for every one of those feature branches, I have to have a test environment. If you have a very large, very big test environment and you decide you're going to do feature branches, you have to replicate that test environment for however many different features you have, because you need to test your features before you push it up to the dev branch. Because what if I don't test my features and I merge them into my dev branch and all of a sudden I start finding tons of problems? Well, now it's already inextricably linked with my other code. I can't easily pull it out. Other changes have been put in on top of it. Now I have to spend the time to fix it, even though the bugs may be of such an order that I can't fix them before release. Now what do? you get into trouble. So you want to do your feature testing on your feature branches. And in fact, this is how Microsoft's developer division works. The folks who work on the ALM tools work in what they call feature crews. And so this is the kind of structure that they use. Not exactly, but it's pretty close. So at that particular point, I've illustrated promoting dev to QA, doing some testing here, promoting it up to prod. At the point that I have done testing on this, I can now merge my dev branch into feature 1, into feature 2 and feature 3. So why do I want to do that? The biggest reason for this is that when I decide to push feature 2 up into production, into my release path, it's got to work with feature 1. I want to find the problems on the softest branch where I'm going to have the highest code churn and I can isolate my issues. So if I merge from dev down to feature 2, if feature 1 and feature 2 have any conflicts, I already know feature 1 works. It's been tested. Maybe it's been released, maybe it hasn't, but it's been tested. So if I find a problem with feature 1 on this branch, then I need to either fix it or change feature 2 so it doesn't conflict with my feature 1. This sounds a little complicated, but it should be pretty straightforward and fairly obvious. When I'm done with my feature 2, same pattern, I push it up there. Any fixes that I need to do to feature 2 now are being done on this branch, and then I push it down to feature 3, and I can go do my work as I want to go do my work. One thing about this is that you have to do, the folks working on the individual features have to remember to do gets out of the dev branch periodically so that they're less likely to find bugs and merge conflicts as they go down. So consider the situation where you don't do a merge for 2 months. Well, that's 40 working days worth of code that more than likely is going to be in conflict with something you were working on, and it's going to become that much more difficult to go back and try and fix it. The other thing also is that out of these feature branches, you want to be doing builds out of each branch. You do not want to just be doing builds out of dev. So if you do continuous integration, which is a best practice, then you want to set up continuous integration for every one of these feature branches because you want these things constantly being built. And when you do a merge, it's just as important to do your builds constantly also. So every time I do a check-in, it's not a bad idea to do that, especially after a merge. I saw, yes? How do you mean opportunities? Okay. Yeah, let's call a bug for what it is. It's a bug. I can't stand when a business comes to me and goes, we have some opportunities to make things better, and my usual question is how big is the opportunity? And that just scares me. So when you find a bug in QA, you handle it just the way you would for the branch by quality stuff. You would take a hotfix off of QA and go ahead and fix it there. In the mixing and matching of patterns, you want to keep the structures of each individual pattern separate. So this one, if you find a bug down on the feature branches somewhere, you're going to go and you're going to fix them on the feature actually on that branch, or if you find a bug on the dev branch, you'll fix it on the dev branch. When you start moving up the pattern, you fix it the same way you would for branch by quality. Yeah? So good question. So the question was, when you're working on multiple features at the same time, how do you keep track of which solution you have open at the time, right? Which is hard because your solution has the same name, it's got all the same code in there. The only difference is features, which may or may not be large or small, and it might not be easy to tell. There's not a great answer for that. There's 2 answers that I'll give you though. First one is create separate workspaces for each feature. Because then, if you're accidentally working in the wrong workspace, you can't check in to the feature branch that you want to work on, right? Your workspaces are totally separate. In one workspace, you say, I'm just going to get feature 2, and in another workspace, you're just going to get feature 3. So those things are actually logically separated. And the way that actually materializes, right, you actually could do a check-in, but you're checking into the original branch. So the way it materializes is when you go to do a check-in in the pending changes window. In fact, why talk about it when I can show you? When you're in the pending changes window here, it's got your workspaces listed here. And the way this usually manifests itself, so this happens to me because I happen to keep separate workspaces for the different features that I'm working on when I'm doing feature work, is your code doesn't show up as a pending change. You go, wait a second, I just changed this code, where is it? then you got to go look through your workspace and figure out which workspace you were actually in. The other thing also is, for whatever reason, this hasn't become a common aspect yet, but Microsoft helpfully provides you the start page with your last few solutions that you opened on it. Well, when you're doing feature branches and it's the same solution name for everything, you have no way to tell which features, which versions those actually are, which branch they came from. In that particular case, always open up your solution from Source Control Explorer. Do not open up your solution from your hard drive, because unless you're very diligent about naming your branches, you will open up the wrong one eventually. So those are two ways to kind of keep it straight. At the end of the day, it requires developer discipline. There's no way you can just, or you can lock them out of certain branches, but usually we see developers working on multiple features at once. So that's where that becomes a problem. It takes discipline. I will tell you there's no easy way to get around that particular problem. The other thing also, yes? Wait, hang on. Let me run down and hear you. Yeah. Or microphone, but I'll walk. I'm good. All right, what's the question?
Sort of in that same vein, we have a lot of things where a developer will get several small changes. So what about, instead of branch by feature, branch by development? As a kind of a temporary holding area for that, what that person's working on.
Okay, interesting question. So the question is we get a lot of little changes that get assigned to a developer. What about branch by developer instead of branch by feature? So the short answer is that's not a good idea. And the reason why I say that is that I'm not saying it can't work, but the reason why I say that is because typically developers might get a bunch of small little changes each and they've got to work on them, but at some point, two developers are going to be working on the same thing. Now, if they're working on different branches, the likelihood of merge conflicts is going to go up, and the likelihood of problems after the merge conflict are going to go up also, so test failures. It is better to have them grouped by feature, because then they're working on that feature together and then moving on to the next one. Developers are certainly more than free to take independent branches. And we have lots of developers who do that, right? It's a fairly common thing for a developer to go, I just want to work on my stuff. I don't want to work on it on the main development branch. I don't want to work on it on the feature branch. I just want to kind of work on it independently on my own. You can definitely do that. The issue is, of course, that when you try and give developer A's code to developer B, you've got to do it through a branching strategy where you're pushing it up into dev and then down into the other developer's environment, or you're pushing it into your feature branch, then into dev, then down to the other feature branch, then down to the other developer's folder. Whichever pattern you get, it gets a little complicated, and you start polluting your code up and down. It's something I would avoid, because the other way around that is to do a baseless merge from developer 1's code to developer 2's code, and we try and avoid baseless merges. And I guess I'll say one little word about that here, is that I said earlier that baseless merges are not necessarily a bad thing. If the code is virtually identical, we took the same code, but we took it from different branches, doing a baseless merge is not all that bad because it's the same code, it's the same. Where baseless merges become ridiculous, and I hear this talked about a lot when you're talking about other branching tools which don't have this concept of a baseless merge, right? You can just merge any two branches together. Well, that makes zero sense. If I've got two totally different applications, I'm just going to merge them together, and I happen to have a file that may have the same name, and then what am I going to do? So just free merging all over the place is kind of a stupid idea. You want to make sure that they have the same type of pedigree, same hierarchy, that they came from the same parent at some point in their lifetime, so that there's similarities between the code branches. In general, we try and tell people to avoid baseless merges. And also because you have to drop to the command line to do it, which some people like doing the command line. I don't particularly like it. But that's another way where if you've got developers working on two things, same features, and you have to share code, you have to do it via baseless merge. So just try and avoid it. Yes? Say that again, the file naming convention for... So that's actually a good point. So the question was, so you're seeing this, so he said you're seeming to imply, get this working right, that using local folder names for which feature you're working on your local machine is a bad idea. No, not at all, in fact. It's perfectly okay to do that, which means that, for example, if I'm working on feature 1, and I might get it into a folder on my local machine called feature 1. If I'm working on another feature, it's going to be in a folder called feature 2. Actually, we would expect folks to do that, right? Because as I'm branching these different features, they're going to have different names in my hierarchy. I'm going to either name them my feature name or go F1, F2, F3. That's okay. The one area you have to be careful of, this isn't really an issue so much about branching and merging it as it is source code discipline, is Visual Studio, as all of you well know, works on relative path names. The only thing that we say that is absolutely critical is that your paths must be at the same level. In other words, if somebody does a get of code and they put it in C:\TFS/my project, and somebody else, and they get one project there and then another project that they have a dependency on at a different level, and then somebody else does a get at different levels as well, well, guess what? Your relative paths have changed. So what happens there is we get into a really great situation where one developer checks in code, another developer does a get latest, and they can't even build the application because it can't even find all the projects because it's looking in the wrong directories for it. So it's okay to have different folder names as long as your relative path structure is the same. So yeah, that's a way to differentiate it locally. Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm. So the question is, let me see if I get this right, make it a little bit shorter here. The question is, if we've got a bunch of different feature branches, is it really the best practice to, once you've released that feature, to no longer work on that feature branch? How do you manage all these different features and changes to that feature going forward? So I'll give you the Agile approach, and then I'll kind of talk a little bit about reality. In Agile, right, there's not really changes to things, right? It's just a new feature, right? So technically, that would be a new feature branch. Now, reality check. It's a change to a feature. It might be a new story, but you're changing the feature. It is okay to go back to that feature branch and continue to work it. But the reason why I kind of recommend not doing it is because then you have to take the responsibility of making sure that feature branch is in sync all the time, and you have to maintain a test environment for it. In the way where if you're not maintaining your feature branch, you're simply, let's say you're always working on 3 features at a time, and you're maintaining these 3 other test environments. When I'm done with one feature, I'm now working my next one, I still have 3 environments. If I just continually start adding to my features, and sometimes I'm making changes to features and sometimes I'm not, I may have to spool up more and more test environments. And with virtualization, while test environments are fairly cheap, we've seen some customers who have 15, 20 machines in a test environment because that's what it takes to run their application. It can get expensive and complicated. There shouldn't be any reason why you couldn't make a change to that specific feature in the development branch. Assuming the code is structured the right way and you can figure out where that feature is there, leaving that feature branch open for a long period of time means that you've got to do maintenance work on that feature branch so that it's in sync with everything else. And I'll give you, for example, we've had situations where people have left feature branches out for a while, and then they have said, oh, we need to go in here and make this change. And they've made a change in the feature branch, but they did the change before they merged down from their dev environment, and they broke a whole bunch of stuff because it had been stale for like 3 months. You can just get into problems like that. There's obviously ways around it, but just for my money, I kind of tend to avoid it. But there's nothing that says you can't do it as long as you're diligent about maintaining the feature branch. So, and that's another thing to note also, folks, is that there's no real right or wrong here. I mean, sometimes there are things that are absolutely wrong to do. But for the most part, it's whether or not you have the resources to actually manage this. A lot of teams can't afford a release manager. So who's going to manage all your branches and figure out where everything is? It becomes kind of tough. It's a full-time job in some organizations. They have a release manager. That's all they do is manage where these things are on a code branch. If you can afford to do that, great, gives you a little bit more flexibility. If you can't, you have to be a little bit more diligent in how you do things. Oh, other questions on this? No. Yes? Okay, so right. So the question is we want to maintain tight control of our QA branch, which is actually a very good idea because we don't want developers going in and playing with code that they have said is ready to be released and that the testers are testing. So when you're setting up your roles, typically we set developers for read-only access, so contributors for read-only access to the QA branch, and I will create a separate QA group that has full permissions to the QA branch. You want them to have read access because you want them to be able to do merge downs, but that also puts an added burden onto your QA folks that they are responsible for merging from the dev branch to the QA branch. So you've got to have somebody there with a little bit of smarts, but because you're doing merge down, copy up, there should never be a merge conflict. And because developers have read-only access, they can take a branch off of QA and create a hotfix branch if they need to. And again, the same thing applies. QA is responsible for merging from hotfix back up to the QA branch. So there's a little bit of responsibility for the release team to do merges into QA. But aside from that, that's it. So that's going to be your best way to maintain control of that branch. Right. So yeah, so you can get really complicated. So what he was saying is that the QA team didn't feel comfortable with this, and they denied check-in rights. And what typically happens there, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, you let the developers do the merge, but then they have to shelve it, call somebody from QA, QA unshelves it and does the check-in. That actually gets more complicated than simply training one person in QA to do the merge, because if you're doing the merge down, copy up, there really should never be a conflict. So the actual merge process is pretty straightforward. Again, it's the skill set of your team and whether or not it'll work or not. I'm not saying that there's any particular, again, right or wrong way to do that. It's going to be dependent on your resources. Yeah. Are there any limitations to the practical number of feature branches you can have? None that I know of. I'm not aware of any. I'm sure there's some sort of limitation at some point or another, but if you get up to that kind of limitation, then maybe we should talk about a different branching strategy. So I don't think it's that. I think it's pretty high if there's any limitations at all. You could do that. That would be a hell of a development team, though, because that's a lot of features to juggle. But yeah, you could do that. Yeah. Okay. I have 15 minutes left, so I've got enough time to do a demo and show you some documentation. I'm going to flip that around a little bit. When you're coming up with a branching strategy, I'm going to show you two documents. One of them, one's an old version, one's a newer version. So this is a document that I create for the customers that I work with, and we have to go in and revamp their branching structure. And what we do here is we list out the responsibilities. So what are the administrators' responsibilities, the dev leads, the developers themselves, the project structure, and the branching structure. Now, these are when I was using Visio for graphics. This was kind of a complicated environment where they had a lot of branches. And they were essentially doing feature branches, but they had multiple test environments because the managers, the business managers, could never decide which features they wanted to release until like 2 days before the release, which of course the development team just loved. They were originally trying to do it where they would hold off on any merges until 2 days before the release, and then they would cherry pick all their features. They had, I think at the time, it was 2 release managers working 80 hours of overtime a week in total. We had to come in and revamp their branching and release structure, and we eliminated the overtime altogether. So sometimes you take a good pattern and you apply it to a bad situation and you're in for a lot of work. So this structure, we've documented out what each branch is for. We have put in what happens when you do a release to QA. And at this particular time, I was putting in which test environments they were going to because they were going to different test environments. But you'll notice where I've got labels here, I've got step-by-step instructions on how to do it, and then a description of what each of those steps are. This is fairly simple. If you took out just the branching pages, it's about 3 pages. This should be something any developer or QA person should be able to read and understand from your release process. So releasing to production, the problems with testing, hot fixes. They were working on a permanent hotfix branch. In this particular one, I've got a section, bug is found before Wednesday and bug is found Wednesday afternoon because they did their release to QA on Wednesday afternoon. So if they found a bug before then, they just simply fixed it on the development branch and it was no big deal because they had testers constantly testing stuff on the development branch. And after Wednesday, they actually had to go through a hotfix process. But all of these are very clearly documented out, including how to do baseless merges if they needed to do it, and there was actually a valid situation where they had to do baseless merges. So this is one document. It's kind of an original document that I was working off of. This is kind of a later version of the document. In this particular case, we set the permissions for who is going to have permissions for doing each particular thing on each particular branch. This was for a financial services company that had to have SOX compliance, so they had to know who had rights to which particular branch. So you can see here there's a source code, which is the dev branch, the source code unit test, which is a unit branch, which is kind of unit testing, the source code model branch, which is what I would refer to as the QA branch. They had actually 4 branches that they promoted up to, and finally the release one. And for each one, we've got the roles and what permissions they had in those particular branches. Down into the actual promotion of code, we've got the structure documented, along with all of the steps here. So again, steps 1 through N with a description of them. Bug found in the model environment, bug found in the unit environment, bug found in production and fixed off the model environment, and bug found in production fixed off of release. So this customer wanted to be able to do things multiple ways, so we documented a very straightforward process for each of those ways to do it. This reference, as far as I know, still sits on their desk as a reference for when they go to do their release work. We also had folder structures. So I mentioned earlier there was a customer who wanted to have each hotfix independent. This was that customer. So you can see here they had each hotfix number in a hotfix for off of the releases and off of the model, so they knew where they fixed the hotfix as well, or where they fixed the bug as well. This was probably a more complicated structure than most people need, but the documentation still is only 20 pages, along with the description of the different branches and different strategies and workspace mapping, so how they were actually going to map this so that they didn't lose where they were when they were developing. The traceability, so where they were going to be able to, what they were going to be able to trace to from their environments. And where it was all going to, which builds that they were going to run. So in this particular case, this is talking about the automated builds that are going to come out of each branch, which, how many of you are doing automated builds? Okay, that's actually good. That number's going up each year. So it looks like about 3/4 of you. So everyone should be doing automated builds. So these are the different builds that we set up for them so that they would know which code was coming out of each branch. And for example here, in the model branch, there was a release build, and you can see it was run by service delivery. And these were the folks that were responsible for doing the actual release, the actual deployment of bits onto the production environment. Whereas in unit, the developers or testers could run the build whenever they wanted to, or there was what was called a promotion build where they were going to promote it up to the next level. I call it a promotion build for this reason. It's kind of one of those things that may be helpful to know, although it's not directly related to branching. When you do a build in TFS, it labels your build. And when you do another build at TFS, what it does is it looks at the 2 labels, it looks at the differences between them, it looks at all the code that was checked in and all the work items associated with that code when they were checked in. And it will give you a report on that, right? It falls out on the build report so that you can see everything that changed. Well, if you're constantly doing check-ins and builds, so let's say you're doing nightly builds, that'll pick up your changes every night. But what if I want to know what are all the changes that I'm pushing into production from the last time I pushed into production? Well, you can't rely on your nightly builds to do it, otherwise you have to go back over every single build report and essentially summarize it all. Or you can do a promotion build, which you run at the beginning of your your development cycle, and then you run it at the end before you promote everything to QA. Now I've got a list of everything that changed from the time I was doing my work. It's kind of a simple, easy, quick fix for figuring out what's actually going on here. So anyways, this guide is pretty helpful, reduction of risk, so how they were actually going to do things. And this was the release strategy, their physical environment that they were actually releasing to, and how they actually went about releasing to it, where the build server was dropping bits to. Again, not specific necessarily to branching, but the original part of that was the branching structure. Should be fairly easy to document. If any of you want a copy of these documents or of the graphics that I used to create them, it's just a PowerPoint deck. I figured doing it in PowerPoint was kind of easy because I had to present it to somebody eventually anyway. I'm more than happy to provide those to you, and you can just shoot me an email. It's on the last slide, which I'll pop up in a minute. So last really quick demo on branch by feature. So what we'll do is come in here, view the history. So you can see here kind of the pyramidal view of it, the relationship between all of my different branches here, feature 1, 2, and 3 are all off of dev. And you can see timeline tracking. I was in QA, branch to dev, and then branch dev down to each of these different feature branches here. Again, this structure is conceptually very simple to understand as well. So what I'm going to do here is go into feature 1 and make the proverbial change here. Pick a different class this time. I'm pretty sure that that change will work. Okay, so at this point, I can either merge this on the visualization surface, or I can just merge it here, which I'm just going to merge it here. So we'll take feature 1, we'll merge it up to dev. It automatically picks its sibling, especially if it's only got one or its related branch. Latest version, we're going to do a finish. Check that change into dev. And now at this point, all of the features here are simply going to get a copy of dev when they go into a merge. And so they'll merge down from dev into feature 2. And theoretically, they will get all the stuff that's in feature 2. And you'll do a merge down into feature 3. You normally wouldn't do both of those merges and check-ins at the same time. But now I've got all of my code down into the features, so if I actually go and look at, let's look at feature 3, and track this. And you can see here that the feature, so the change set that was in 40 got merged down into feature 2 and feature 3. And it went from feature 1 to dev. So again, it displays it kind of weird. I have no control over that. But you can see the path of code from my feature branch to my dev branch down to my other feature branches. Again, conceptually fairly easy to understand and visualize. Any questions any other questions on the branch by feature, or any general questions, because we're kind of towards the end of the talk? Yes? Am I familiar with lightweight branching? I've never heard the term before. Although, actually, that's not true. Somebody the other day said that TFS was heavyweight branching versus lightweight branching. I'm not sure what that actually means. So I've heard the term before. I have no idea what it means. So, and I guess one thing to bring up when it comes to branching being heavyweight, since I happen to have heard this the other day, in TFS 2010, it doesn't actually do a get to your local machine in order to branch. It just does a server branch, which is why the branch is really fast. I can probably branch 100 megabytes of code in 5 seconds. It doesn't take that long at all. It's just one thing to consider when you're doing branching. It's actually not a lot of space on the server itself. Right, and they don't copy it, right? They create a pointer to it until you actually make a change, and then they solidify it. So from that perspective, branching actually is fairly lightweight in TFS, at least by my definition of lightweight. Okay, so the last slide here is what to consider when deciding on a strategy. There's a couple of things. First, let me tell you, this is not definitive. There's lots of things that play into here. I've seen lots of other different variations. But as a starting point for where you might want to go down and what questions you might want to ask, the first thing you want to know is how many releases do I have to support? If I have to support lots of releases, you can throw branch by quality right out the window. If I have to support concurrent releases, then I'm going to go with the mainline release. If not, I can go with branch by release. It's a much simpler branching structure. Again, you always want to go to the simplest branching structure you can. Having a complicated branching structure looks cool, but doesn't work in practice in a lot of cases. If you've got a short release time, you can go with branch by quality. And again, the short release time is because of the situation I told you earlier. It's much easier to go to a customer and say, hey, can you wait a week or two till the next release to get this in there? And that really fits well with a lot of agile development where we see a lot of iterations being 2 weeks now. Is theoretically, that's a very easy fit there. And if you have a long release time, and by long release time, I generally mean a long testing cycle, is where we run into problems. The longer code sits in test, the more likely somebody's going to find a problem in production that we're going to have to fix, which is what causes our problems there. So if you have a long release time, then doing branch by release also makes sense because you remember on the branch by release structure, I just have a single branch that's out there forever until I decide that I'm not going to support that release anymore. So you don't have to worry about bunches of merges or anything. On the other side, you've got business being very uncertain. And again, these aren't mutually exclusive, right? You can be supporting multiple releases with a business that's completely uncertain. We've actually seen this happen before. This tree can grow exponentially depending on what kind of crazy situations that you happen to be in. So if you've got a short iteration length, branch by quality makes sense because the business is going to say, I need this for this iteration. You're going to build it in 2 weeks and you're going to release it. 1 week into it, they're not going to say, oh, I didn't really mean that I wanted that. I wanted this other feature and go build it in a week. They're not likely to do that. Whereas if you have a longer iteration, you can simply expect that the customer, that your customer, your business customer is going to say, I need a change. There's more likely that there's going to be churn because business moves very quickly today. So it's something to take into account when you're doing that. I'm sure there are other things that folks can think of, and if they have other situations, I'm actually happy if people email those to me, because I'd like to be able to incorporate different scenarios. Most of these are from my experience of what I've run into most commonly. So any general questions and answers, anything that I can show you, anything that I haven't really answered? Oh, there were 2 that I didn't handle with the Excel and the database stuff, but I'll get those in just a second. Yeah. So the question was, when I'm talking about single or multiple, am I talking about how many releases or how many am I supporting in dev? I'm talking about how many releases I'm supporting in production. That's what I'm talking about. Yeah, when you get down to the concurrent path, that's really more how many am I supporting in dev. And those are really 2 different sides of the coin there. Other questions? Yes? Not the way Subversion does it. In fact, labels in TFS don't work anything like Subversion tags or CVS tags. They just don't work the same. So to that I would say no, because a tag itself can almost be treated as a branch. There's lots of different ways you can treat tags, which is what makes them flexible and what makes them problematic. I will say it's both sides. There's two sets of issues there, but no. No, there isn't. Taking a branch is the equivalent. Other questions? Yes? Do you ever delete a branch? Yeah, I delete branches a lot when I'm done with them and I don't need them anymore. I actually get rid of them or destroy them. By the way, as people start wandering out of the room, I'm happy to keep answering questions, but please remember to fill out your evals. Very important. So good scores, bad scores. I love comments. More comments, the better. Yeah, I saw a hand. Yeah. Is there a way to move a branch? So, tough question. If you actually have a branching icon next to it, you can't have that branch contained in another branch. If you have a folder in that branch, however, you can easily move it down to another branch. It's fairly easy. So it just depends on which level you're doing it, but you can always turn a branch back into a folder and a folder into a branch. Really what the branching icon gives you is the visualization ability, and it gives you a couple of little more security options there that you can prevent merging into it or prevent people from taking a branch from it. So there's a couple little options to actually having at the branch structure, but having multiple branches on another branch is not one of them. Yes?
Do you have any comments on database code?
Yeah, so that was one of the questions that was asked earlier, database code. The database code is actually the same as your source code, right? Because you're releasing your database and your source code in sync. You're not really ever going to release them out of sync. If you change your database structure, you had to have changed your source code. Otherwise, you're not reading that field or deploying that field, in most cases. But what we would say is that the code that is released together stays together. So if I'm releasing my database code with my source code, then those things stay together. I do not manage them independently of one another.
As a follow-on, how about labels?
How about
Labels?
labels? I don't like labels all that much because labels can change on you. Labels are good for short-term identification of items. When it comes to releases and branching, create a branch, don't create a label. Because labels are mutable, so they can actually change, and there's no record of changes made to a label. There's no history with the label. So if somebody makes a change to my label, I will never know it, and the contents of that label can change. So if they reapply the label with the same name to other files, I don't know that they did that. I have no way to know. So stay away from labels, especially if you're in any industry that requires you to be audited by something. You will fail an audit, pretty much right off the bat. Yeah? The slide deck actually should be up on the side. I thought it was there earlier under the session title. Oh, yeah, it should be up there. Maybe it was up there for me because I was the speaker. But it should be up there. But if not, send me an email. I will make sure you get it, that and the Word documents if you want those and the branching graphics. All right, anything else before we're done? No? All right, great, guys. Have a great day.